a great pleasure now to welcome John Dolan to the Fest 3 for Cargo and Commercial Ship Surveyors. This is the second presentation we've had from the Standard Club. And as I said to Akshat this morning, we're very grateful to have input from the P&I clubs. I think it's very, very important that there's a dialogue between surveyors and P&I clubs in this kind of environment. So I got to meet John back in about this time last year, actually, John, wasn't it? We were on board the QE2 at a conference. It was the 10th anniversary of the...
That's correct, Mike. Yes, it was.
Branch. Yeah, which was great fun. John and I shared a table there. John gave a presentation not dissimilar to this. I know he's updated though. And I would say this is a very on-topic trend. So delighted, John, that you've agreed to come and speak. And I should have called you Captain John Dolan, of course, so my apologies for that. And I'll now hand over to John.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much indeed. And can you hear me still?
Loud and clear. Good,
good. Well, I'm a little bit skeptical, guys, of technology, particularly when you're working from home. So apologies for the repeated sound checks and the reassurance. My name is John Dolan, indeed, as Mike said, and I'm the Deputy Director of Loss Prevention at the Standard P&I Club. We, as an insurer of a very large proportion of the international fleet, we insure about 10% of the world fleet. We see incidents, accidents, fires, pollution incidents on a day-to-day basis. One of those kind of trending challenges for the last few years has been container vessels and the issue of misdeclared cargoes. So that's why I'd like to concentrate on that particular topic today. So a little bit about myself before we start. I'm a master mariner by background, and I returned to university many years ago for a couple of years after being at sea, and I ended up with a degree in ship management and international shipping. I have spent most of my career since then in ship management and ship operations, prior to joining the Standard Club 5 years ago, where my job now is effectively recycling that experience back into the industry and into the from the marine industry into the insurance industry, with briefing underwriters and claims guys on a daily basis. Also, in a previous life as a ship manager, I was also a board member of the International Chamber of Shipping for 5 years. So I'm very familiar with the negotiations and discussions and the debates that take place in that forum also. So this talk is about misdeclared cargoes. And I want to give you a little bit of context about how we got here, some of the casualties that have been encountered along the way to this particular point in time now. I'll talk to you a little bit about misdeclared cargoes, the why, the how, and the what. That goes to the core of the talk. And then just talk about the container industry working together, what initiatives are out there to try and address this ongoing major problem for the industry and for the insurers, and some of the initiatives that might be adopted to help address the challenges. And I'll talk a little bit about the slot charter agreements as well towards the very end, in a very, very light touch way to show what role they play and what initiatives they might adopt to improve the situation. So, how we got here, and this is why. Now, some of you might recognize that particular incident. It was the KMTC Hong Kong at Lem Chabang last year. A very dramatic incident, very dramatic footage entered the I suppose, the popular media, but right across the board, it brought into sharp relief as if any further relief wasn't required, of what the challenges are in container shipping and what dangers lurk in the boxes on board vessels that very, very frequently go undetected, mostly undetected, until a situation like that arises. Here are just two further examples of casualties that have had similar, and this is going back some way in history now, but you have the Hyundai Fortune in 2006 and the CMA Jakarta in 1999, the two major casualties, but again illustrating the dangers associated with misdeclared cargo, and also illustrate well the damage that's done, the destruction that's wrought upon a vessel, and the difficulties that the guys on board the vessel, the crew, have on board the vessel when a situation like this arises. As a point, I sat in a conference last year when a senior safety representative from one of the major container lines remarked, when we're talking about fire, he remarked that in reality, crew members on board can address maybe one fire. That's one box in one location fire. But when that becomes two, it gets very difficult. And when it becomes three and out of control, then it's almost abandoned ship time. So that's how serious the situation is when a fire breaks out on board. But they continue, because in the text I'm reading now on the bottom of the slide, a significant fire occurs. It's estimated that a significant fire on board a container vessel on average every 30 days. And this is completely unacceptable. And already, according to the SINS data, and I'll remark further about SINS in the remainder of the presentation, but 11 fires have been reported to SINS in 2020. So again, of this nearly, well, it's more than one a month, because this is up to October on average. And the cost of the insurance sector, based upon data supplied by the TT Club, is around $500 million per year. So the amount at stake in these situations is enormous. And it doesn't stop on board the vessel, because this is an image of Tianjin after they had an enormous explosion there a few years ago. So this illustrates the point that it's not just on board a ship. The dangers are in the boxes. The boxes can be anywhere in the supply chain. And in this case, you can see the magnitude of the destruction in Tianjin. Of course, this has focused the authorities' minds in China to the problem, and to some degree, maybe to even a large degree, the situation is being addressed, but it still continues other parts of the world also. So misdeclared cargoes remain a problem. For a little bit of context, just to put a perspective on this thing, I've put the slide in to illustrate the evolution of the container vessel. And more particularly, I'm from the point C to E, C being, we'll say, the post-Panamax around 6,000 to 8,500 tons around the year 2000. And here we are 20 years later, just 20 years later, we have ship size now with the ultra-large container vessel, 22, 23,000 TEU, 3 times increase in terms of the ship carrying capacity in that period. So the magnitude of the vessels is quite astonishing, quite astonishing. And when you have 22,000 boxes on board, from an insurer's perspective, from a ship manager's and a crew, a master's perspective, the dangers are huge if something gets out of control, like an emergency arising from a fire. So that's just for context. And further background on this, we estimate, and I think this is a very, very rough estimate, we estimate that there are about 200 million TEU containers shipped every year, to about 200 million. And based upon data that we shared and obtained from the TT Club, the reckon is that about 10% of that 200 million is dangerous goods. But, and here is the real concern for insurers and for safety managers and masters, around 1/3 of that DG cargo is misdeclared. That is the belief. Now, on board any ship at any one time, it may be zero or it may be a number of times that. We're not sure, but it's a very, very approximate figure. But in reality, that translates into potentially around 6.5 million containers yearly, or 18,000 containers daily, are misdeclared. And that is, in a nutshell, the real concern. Because we know that it just takes one misdeclared cargo in the wrong place at the wrong time can spark a disaster on board a vessel, with all the attendant challenges that comes with it. So, just to talk a little bit about misdeclared cargoes and how it happens, we frequently see cargoes such as calcium hypochlorite described as water treatment or bleaching powder or lime or other variations on the theme. Activated charcoal being described as water pipe tablets. Lithium ion batteries described as mobile phone accessories or electronic parts or something like that. And why do these misdeclarations take place? Well, it is to avoid, we believe, the IMDG restrictions on packaging and quantity. In other words, the shippers are trying to avoid the hassle factor associated with the declarations of dangerous goods, and also to avoid the additional carrier for charges for carrying that dangerous goods. The surcharge, I think, is about $1,400 per box, but of course that varies from shipper to shipper from time to time, but it's of that order of magnitude. So somebody is shipping dangerous goods to save $1,000 or $1,000 or $1,400, which is utter insanity. And also, maybe some carriers would have a policy, a blanket policy of not permitting dangerous goods on board. So misdeclaration is the easiest way to get around that particular restriction. And here's an example just taken from a report I received last month. This is just a very brief description of a fire in a box on a vessel from China to Singapore. The vessel departed Shekou, I think it was, the port, bound for Singapore. Smoke was reported from the container located deep in the cargo hold, buried deep in the stow. The crew reacted well. They released the CO2 and extinguished the fire. Now that's good fortune rather than real skill, because in any fire you do need luck on your side to be absolutely successful. But the box was discharged at Singapore when the vessel got there, but on lifting the container, the bottom fell out of it, and the fire continued to burn in the bottom of the cargo hold. And the cargo had been declared as manganese dioxide cells and shown on the bill of lading as electronic goods. But the packing list and the commercial invoice revealed lithium ion batteries. Now, the challenges and the risks associated with carrying batteries, used batteries, is well known right now. The exact initiator or stimulus for this particular fire is still being investigated, but the point was that cargo should not have been misdeclared, and it should not have been stowed where it was, deep in the hold. Just another example of the challenges that I'm describing right now. So I mentioned the SINS. Now SINS, and my apologies for explaining it so late as this, but it stands for the Cargo Incident Notification System, and it's and how it came about. This was a group that was established in 2011. It was an initiative of the major container carriers at the time, and was also joined by the international group of P&I clubs. So it was carriers and insurers were simply alarmed by what was happening and the frequency of these fires. So they got together to form this group. And the purpose of the group is to highlight the risks posed by certain cargoes and packing failures. So it really focuses in on the DG goods that are shipped on container vessels. But the primary purpose of the group is what it says, cargo incident notification system. It captures and analyzes information and makes recommendations relating to the carriage of dangerous goods. And so out of that forum comes a publication, or came a publication 18 months ago, 2 years ago now, on the guidelines for the carriage, for the safe carriage of calcium hypochlorite. And all arising from that particular initiative and the success of it, other guidelines have been published since on the carriage of hides, carriage of charcoal, I believe, and others as well, all which are freely available up on the international group's websites or on the websites of the individual P&I clubs. But also this group does show as well that properly declared, packed and stowed calcium hypochlorite is safe to carry in containers and need not be banned. So what we're saying is that goods which are properly declared and stowed in the appropriate places safely, and they can be carried safely. That's the point. So good guidance about the safe carriage of dangerous goods is what SINS is about, amongst other things. The pie chart on the side, or at least the chart on the side, shows some of the major incidents in October where inspections revealed the major areas of concern. That was about half. But you can see that misdeclarations was discovered in 17 cases. And as I say, it just takes one misdeclaration of a cargo in the wrong place at the wrong time will cause, or can cause, a disaster on board. So misdeclared cargo, how is it misdeclared? I'll just talk about a bit more about this, just to show you the dangers and the difficulties that the various stakeholders, the carriers, the insurers, port, state, customs are wrestling with these days. Well, the misdeclaration can occur in the following ways, and I mentioned earlier on with the manganese, the lithium iron battery has been described as manganese cells. The use of a synonym instead of a proper shipping name. Again, calcium hypochlorite has been bleaching powder, it's been pool wash, it's been cleansing agents. It doesn't get described as calcium hypochlorite because it knows that the shipper knows that it will be picked up and intercepted and refused if it's not declared correctly. Last minute bookings is a frequent aspect of this. We understand commercial pressure is put on the carrier. The shipper will declare the cargo in a very much an outline, and then at the last minute will hit the shipper or hit the carrier with a last minute declaration. Now puts commercial pressure on the carrier to take the cargo. Also, we know that there is multiple use of freight forwarders. In order to try and disguise the origin of the particular cargo, it will frequently be directed through a number of freight forwarders in order to try and disguise both the content and who the original shipper was. Fraudulent customs and laboratory documents, well, that goes without saying. I'm sure as all surveyors, you have come across similar kind of incidents where there's been fraudulent use of documentation to disguise the cargoes. And then also an obvious one is the last minute change to the bill of lading. So there will be a misdeclaration made, and then suddenly the shipper tries to make it right by making a change to the bill of lading after the cargo has been shipped on board. Now, that is a tactic that's well used as well, and we're familiar with it. So those are just some of the methods that are used to get the cargo, the dangerous cargo, which is being misdeclared, onto vessels. So what can be done? And should we open and survey every container? Should we stop charging for the surcharge for the dangerous goods? Well, these are questions that the industry has been wrestling with for a long time. But just think of the practicalities here for a moment. If we're talking about a 20,000 TEU vessel, for example, even if we could survey each container in 1 minute, just 1 minute, 20,000 minutes is a very, very long time, a very long time. It doesn't take a genius to work out the man hours required to do that. We're talking many days of surveying on a 24 hours a day basis. So the reality is that it is probably not feasible, even allowing for just 1 minute to check every single container shipped. And that is a structural, a systemic challenge that the container industry has to face. Also, so now what can be done? Well, here begins the kind of pushback, and this is where the P&I clubs and the carriers are working in conjunction with each other to try and raise awareness. So the first basic requirement is that carriers should know their customers. And this is much easier said than done. It is actually quite difficult for all carriers to know all their customers, but it shouldn't reduce the effort made to try and identify who is shipping the good. It's important that the shipper doesn't hide, the fraudulent shipper doesn't hide behind simply a brass plate company set up just to ship goods. Now, when we're talking about container sizes of calcium hypochlorite, we're not talking about a village workshop here. We're talking about production on an industrial scale. But still, we're aware of brass plate companies being formed to get shipments on board vessels. So the carriers are comparing registered addresses with lists of previously rejected company addresses. So there's due diligence being done here. Carrying out public domain search and references, trying to get the booking clerks in the carriers' offices to diligently research as best they possibly can the source and the credentials of the shipper. Trade routes and cargoes carried. If there's suddenly a shipper presenting a cargo that has never appeared before, or if it's heading for an unusual destination, these kind of questions would and should raise flags for further investigation. And now we know that carriers are carrying out an advanced and enhanced customer vetting process to try and address this challenge in more detail, particularly for the freight forwarders themselves, to maybe tie the freight forwarders into the carriers' operations, and so that there's a better transparency of activity. But we know we're not naive about this. The insurers and the carriers recognize that there is a major challenge to make these changes, uh, implement them first and make them effective second. It is difficult. Also, taking those points and then just a slight further description of them here, we think that the booking process has to be tightened up. This is now, having done all the other checks, the actual booking process has to be tightened also. So software, very, very clever software is being designed and and has been in play now amongst the major carriers. The one that's of probably best known right now is Cargo Patrol. I think it was produced by Hapag-Lloyd, and which has been adopted by some of the other carriers in order to catch the misdeclared or undeclared DG goods by using synonyms, by detection of the descriptions. Anything that's suspicious is investigated further. But also more practical aspects are being implemented as well, like clearly defined and enforced booking deadlines for both DG and non-DG cargoes, for existing and for new customers. In other words, that there are deadlines now introduced to reduce the kind of flexibility that aided the shipment or the loading of misdeclared cargoes. The HS code, this is the harmonized system for customs use around the world. There's greater encouragement now to use this code to try and identify the product most specifically through the code, which has better use of descriptions. And again, you would be surprised that I mentioned this thing, but that there should be a thorough check of all documents submitted at the booking stage. Now, you'd imagine that this would be normal, but the reality is it's not, that there are aspects to the booking operation that are just under too much pressure. The booking clerks don't always have the time or the skills, the training to recognize documentation. Therefore, the best practice in the business now is that more time and more resources is given to documentation checking. Background checks on the manufacturer to ensure that they produce the cargo. In other words, that the cargo shipper or the manufacturer, who may not necessarily be the same thing, that there is a thorough investigation and know your customer, know your client, due diligence has been done on them. And that brings me to the point about training, because all of those previous initiatives all depend upon the training, not only to the DG staff, but also to non-DG and to document control. The whole system only works, it's predicated upon people who have the right training, the right knowledge, the right experience, maybe also extending to the use of specialist surveyors to assist in stopping this practice of or improving safety and stopping misdeclared cargo. But we again know, we recognize that this might well be an idealistic approach. In reality, it's harder to implement. We know that, but it doesn't invalidate the efforts that should be made and must be made to try and get a better grip on this particular problem. So what can be done? We were talking about authority levels at the booking clerk's office here. Escalation of authority level clearly defined in case mismatch is found. In other words, that the decision to go, no go, load, don't load, is not resting at the lowest level of the booking clerk structure, that there should well be an escalation anytime a mismatch is found. That is just, in our view, prudence and common sense. And there must be recognition as well that the booking office must have sufficient authority to push back when concerns are raised. In other words, that they're not overridden by other commercial interests further up the chain in the hierarchy, which overrules the booking clerk's concerns. That has to stop. And authority level also to add new customer or cargo to the software. All of these has to be carefully guarded so that there isn't any kind of liberal use or interpretation or relaxation of the rules being done at a local level by an individual without it being absolutely clear to the senior personnel in the operation that these relaxation of the rules has taken place. And last, and we would emphasize this point, there should not be any allowance or permission to load to accept late declaration of non-DG cargoes. We can't have this going on. There has to be a reasonable cutoff where no further cargo is allowed on board, because we strongly suspect that this is one of the principal routes in which misdeclaration of cargo succeeds, through the late presentation or declaration of cargoes. I just mentioned very briefly the slot charterers. This is a very important issue with the safe carriage of goods, because a lot of the cargo, the big container lines, they share slots on board. And this is economically a very prudent thing to do, a very reasonable thing to do in order to use up capacity. So if it can't go on a Maersk ship, it goes on an MSC or it goes on CMA, and they swap and share their space on board to maximize the carrying capacity of the vessel on any particular shipment. But the danger there, of course, is that what one company does well, another company may not do so well. And we are aware of situations where a shipper fails to get his suspicious cargo onto one vessel, so then he goes to another carrier and presents it there. That carrier may not be as diligent and may not detect that there is a problem with the cargo, and suddenly, through the vessel sharing agreement, the cargo ends up back at the first carrier who had refused it because of concerns in relation to the description or to the nature of the cargo. So there's the danger. A good system for sharing and maximizing the economy and carrying capacity of a vessel suddenly becomes a major weakness in detecting dangerous goods. So we are asking and we have been encouraging carriers to beef up their systems, but also in the sharing agreements as well. And just my other point, just maybe laboring this point a bit, the due diligence of the slot charter needs to be relied upon completely. So, but we know that there's a problem with the actual disclosure of commercially sensitive information. So often the information that is shared between the charters, between the vessel sharing agreement participants and the companies is often very light touch. Now, there are anti-competition, antitrust rules that have to be respected for sure, and what can and cannot be shared. But unfortunately, the people who are doing this operation fraudulently with cargo misdeclaration and the fraudulent movement of dangerous goods are exploiting this vulnerability, this issue very effectively. And the rest, the accident, the fire, uh, that becomes history. You can see how it causes a major problem. So we're asking and encouraging the major carriers to know their clients very well, but also know what happens in the with the other participants in the vessel sharing agreements to make sure that they also are doing their part to protect everybody's interest in this process. So it's going to be a very rattled through in a very relatively quick way, Mike, but I'm just going to start summarizing right now what I've just been saying. So my points have been this. A very large number of containers are misdeclared daily. We don't see any immediate reduction in the numbers of misdeclared cargoes and misdeclarations going on. So it remains a very real concern. Clearly, from what I've been saying, you will appreciate that the container industry has to work together to tackle this problem. No one container, given the nature of the business, no one uh, container ship operator or owner can resolve this issue on their own because the weaknesses of because of the vessel sharing agreement for one and the degree of sophistication for two is just too much for a single owner, even for the very, very biggest owner operators to resolve on their own. So it has to be a collective effort. And thirdly, the booking process improvements, controls and streamlining needs to be considered and adopted. From what I've been saying, you'll appreciate the concern that we have on the weaknesses that are almost systemic in those operations. Something has to be done to improve the rigor and discipline of the booking process, and we know that it can be done. So where there's a will, there is surely a way, you know. Knowing your customer is absolutely key. For sure, you do need to know who is shipping the dangerous goods. Um, you need to know if well, you need to know all your customers, but particularly the manufacturers of dangerous goods. And this extends as far as good detective work at the points of shipment as well, so that all suspicions, if there are suspicions, are recognised and are investigated uh, relating to cargo shipments. And I just mentioned the point about the vessel sharing agreement, the slot charters. Clearly, there is room for improvement in tightening up the systems there as well, and that perhaps there would be something like a mutual audit there where Maersk goes to CMA or MSC goes to Hapag-Lloyd, and they mutually carry out their due diligence on those companies, even though they're competitors, but maybe just they can pool their resources on a safety front for the interests of improved safety on board vessels. So audits are some sort of assurance program amongst the competitors is possible just to improve the level of safety. And the training, I refer back to this as well. Uh, the people at the sharp end of this business, on the quay side, in the booking offices, the guys on board the vessels, the shippers, the freight forwarders, training and the raising awareness of the dangers of misdeclared cargoes and the mortal dangers that they present to vessels, masters, and crews on board is very real and is still a very major concern to all the stakeholders in the business. And I'll leave you with just a couple of slides just to illustrate the challenge. You will all be aware of the Maersk Honam and the terrible consequences of a dangerous good. Now, I'm not saying misdeclaration here because up until relatively recently, until the Singaporean authorities published a report, there was a presumption of misdeclaration, but that may not be the case. There's further investigation going on here, but for the purposes of this talk, it just illustrates the dangers of dangerous goods being in a certain place at a certain time, and when it goes wrong, it can go very spectacularly wrong. There's the vessel on fire, disabled, Indian Ocean, and those are two pictures that the masters and the crew members on the bridge before they abandoned ship, but those would have been the last views that would have been on fire in a spectacular way as the crew members tried to evacuate the vessel. If you read the report, you will read in detail of what happened subsequently in the attempts to get off the vessel. Lives were lost. 5 people succumbed to their injuries and died. And it remains a very visible reminder to all concerned that this is a deadly serious business and it must it must be tackled to reduce the risks to the crews on board the vessel primarily and to all of the cargo and stakeholders in the business. So if you want to know more about the questions that I've try to answer in this particular presentation, you could do yourself a favor by visiting our website illustrated there. It's on the Standard Club's website, but the book or the publication that's there that can be downloaded for free was put together by my colleague Eve Vandenborn, and it's called Standard Safety Better Box Booking. It is a fantastic resource for getting a greater understanding of what happens in the box business, how things are booked on board the vessels, how they are carried, what checks are made, etc., with various recommendations that I've summarized rather quickly in this presentation. A very, very well worthwhile exercise to download that if this is an area of particular interest to you. And on that basis, I will complete, Mike, and I will say thank you very much indeed to all for listening to me today. Thank you, and I hope it's been of interest.
John, thank you very much indeed. We've discovered, we've covered off a fair share of rather distressing topics today already, death in enclosed spaces and all of those things. And I just think, yet again, this is another example. I agree entirely with you. It absolutely must be tackled. I've got a question for you on the chat, which is from Ed, who asks, is there a movement by carriers to fine, backcharge shippers that are found to often misdeclare DG cargo? And what is the scope of such charges?
The answer, I will first of all put my hand up here and say I'm not the expert in this area in terms of the charging, so I'm going to caveat my reply here heavily. But I am aware of initiatives by some carriers to impose a surcharge or a fine. Now, the reality is that imposing such a fine is one thing. Enforcing such a fine, as indeed collecting it, is quite another thing. So it may well be more, I'd hate to say PR, but it could well be a difficult initiative to enforce. The levels of fine, I heard various amounts mentioned, $5,000 to $10,000. I'm not absolutely certain of that right now. And I know it was launched to some kind of fanfare about 18 months ago, I think it was now. But I haven't heard anything since, or anything meaningful since. So I'm not so sure that it's been as successful as might have been imagined. And don't forget as well that an inhibitor to such charges would be simply the nature, the brutally competitive nature of the box trades, where if there's a slight movement of pricing pressure on one side, the cargo shifts to another carrier. So it is a very, very price sensitive business. So surcharges, fines, call you what you like, might be a good idea, but enforcing them might be a challenge.
Yes, sadly, I agree with you, John. The other point I had, you talked about pushing this right up the food chain, as it were, if that's the right phrase, to the people, at the top of this scheme, or scam, or whatever you want to call it, or
both
criminal act. Can you almost sort of see a time when you might be sort of appealing to them that this is a moral dilemma? I mean, are they aware of what they are doing? Are they aware of the potential of their actions, and try and play on the moral side? I mean, am I too innocent and simplistic? I don't know.
I wouldn't want to confirm your worst suspicions about the simplicity there, Mike. I'm far too kind for that. I would say that this is I mean the incentive to avoid $1,000 or $1,400 surcharge on a box because it's DG. If people will put lives at risk to save that kind of money, I know, I appreciate it is per box, so if you're shipping a lawful lot of boxes, then it adds up for sure. But the dangers associated with misdeclaration are so great that yes, there should be a moral imperative here to encourage people. Sadly, Mike, it doesn't work. I honestly don't think so. What would make a difference, and what is taking place now, is that the Chinese authorities, for which much of this cargo, at least in the past, originated in China, they have begun to turn the screws on shippers, partly and primarily, I would imagine, because of the Tianjin disaster, to try and tighten up the processes here as well. But there's so much more to go, and there's other areas. I know Indonesia has been another area where cargo has emerged from, charcoal shippers particularly, who try to misdeclare as well.
Yeah, frightening stuff. Any more questions for John before we let him go? No, I think you've done a good job. You touched on the Mersconum. That report is freely downloadable from the IMS website if anybody wants to pick that one up and read it. It was released quite recently, John, wasn't it? Only a couple of months ago?
Well, even less than that. I think the Singaporeans released it about last month, I think it was, and
Yeah,
maybe yeah, you could be right. Actually, I'm not entirely sure. It might be the beginning of October, end of October, beginning of
yeah.
November. But
Current.
it should be required reading though for anybody involved in the safety of shipping, and I would include all of your members on that. The surveyors, I mean, your primary job is to, you know, provide assurance to whatever actually they do, but fundamentally there's a safety dimension to it. And the Maersk Honam investigation published by the report published by the Singaporean authorities should really be required reading. And it's a note itself because I'm about halfway through it already, but I need to finish it off. But there's some really good insights there, particularly in the description of what actually happens on board the vessel in when the incident happened, and the sheer terror that the guys on board were subject to in trying to get off that vessel is most interesting for certainly for anybody who's been at sea and who's actually knows what it's like to be on a ship in troubled times.
And of course, worryingly, you then worry, have concern for their future mental well-being, don't you? Having gone through a
Oh,
scenario like that.
most certainly, most certainly. When you read the article, and particularly around the actions taken by the crew, from the detection to eventual evacuation or abandoning of the vessel, I mean, it is hair-raising stuff. It reads like almost like a thriller. So it is worth reading because of the takeaway there shows all aspects of the dangers of what's involved, plus the importance of emergency procedures and good training. It brings it all into play there in that 1, 2, 3 hour period from detection to abandonment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do have one more question for you that Peter's popped up. With growing global trade via the internet, how do we deal with LCL cargoes and customers?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. I'm off my comfort zone here now. Internet booking, of course, it's a double-edged sword from, particularly from, we'll say, an insurer's perspective, because for sure the upside to the carrier is the efficiency of the booking. You know, it's captured there, one entry, often self-declared, and suddenly it generates all of the processes and documentation necessary for the shipment, and it's all done in a few moments. Of course, that comes at the cost of due diligence. It can be, and so now that opens up all sorts of challenges to, you know, for the LCLs and those people. So um, I really don't know the answer to the question, other than to say that it probably increases the challenges associated with knowing what happens and what's being carried in containers at any particular time. It's difficult.
Yeah. John, thank you very much indeed, and many thanks to the Standard Club for helping us today. Much appreciated. Hope to see you again in the not too distant future.
Well, Michael, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all. I hope all your members are keeping safe in this crazy time.
Well,
Uh,
it
hope
is an odd environment for sure, and I don't know. The vaccine is now, it's coming into UK next week, I'm told. We've got the first doses coming in, and that might help to look like shape the, you know, for a better 2021. So stay safe, John, and look after yourself.
Good. Well, thank you again, Mike. All the very best to you, and good luck.
That's
Bye
great.
bye.
I could ask you just to share your to stop your share.